much was it for you?
I requested it. $5,000.
RPT when the tail served. King, getting it back, sir. Gentlemen, seriously.
Can we please be done now?
Welcome back to the Film Box. If you are here, you already know what this channel is about. We don't just watch films, we open them up. We pull back every layer, look at what's underneath, and figure out what the whole thing is actually saying. And today, I genuinely could not be more excited about the box sitting in front of us because this one is strange and loud and divisive and honestly, more interesting than most people gave it credit for. I've been wanting to do this breakdown for a while now. Monster Hunter came out in 2020, landed in the middle of one of the most chaotic years cinema has ever seen, got torn apart by some critics, celebrated by others, and then quietly found its audience on streaming, where it has been living its best life ever since. I watched this film with a mix of skepticism and genuine curiosity, and what I got back surprised me in ways I want to walk you through carefully. So pull up a chair, let's get comfortable, and let's open this one together. Because every film is a box. And this box has teeth. Now, before we go anywhere else, I want to start with something that most people skip. And it's the thing that, once you know it, completely changes how you watch every single scene in this film. Here is what almost nobody talks about when they talk about Monster Hunter. This film exists because of a video game franchise that has sold over 80 million copies worldwide. 80 million. That is not a niche property. That is a global cultural institution with a fan base that is fanatically devoted, deeply specific about lore, and has been waiting for a live action adaptation since the early 2000s. When director Paul W.S. Anderson stepped up to make this film, he wasn't just making an action movie. He was walking into a room full of people who had spent hundreds of hours in this world, and every single one of them had an opinion about what it should look like on screen. That pressure is invisible when you watch the finished film, but it shaped every decision that was made. And that context is the first thing you need inside your head before we go further. But let's actually go further, because the production story behind this film is something else entirely, and it is a perfect place to start opening this box. Here is the first thing you need to know, and it's something that reportedly came directly from Paul W.S. Anderson himself in multiple interviews. Anderson is married to Mila Jovovich. They have made 6 Resident Evil films together. They are, by any measure, one of Hollywood's most successful creative partnerships in the action blockbuster space. But here's what's fascinating. According to those interviews, Anderson was initially resistant to adapting Monster Hunter. He was familiar with the games, but he wasn't certain the core gameplay loop, which largely involves hunting massive creatures, crafting armor from their parts, and hunting bigger creatures, translated to a compelling human story. What changed his mind, reportedly, was the moment he found an emotional entry point that had nothing to do with the game's lore. He wanted to tell a story about a soldier who gets ripped out of a world and thrown into an alien one. And suddenly the franchise became a container for something much more personal, a film about survival, dislocation, and the discovery of unexpected humanity in an inhuman place. That shift in intention is everything, because once you understand that Anderson wasn't trying to make a Monster Hunter film first and a human story second, he was actually doing the opposite. The film starts making much more sense. The second production fact that deserves your full attention is the filming location. Monster Hunter was largely shot in the Namib Desert, which spans parts of Namibia and South Africa, and this was not a budgetary shortcut. According to production interviews, the desert was chosen specifically because of its visual extremity. It is one of the oldest and most otherworldly landscapes on Earth. Some of those sand dunes have been forming for over 5 million years. When you watch the film and feel genuinely transported, when you feel like you are actually looking at another world, a significant part of that is because you essentially are. The production designers were able to minimize digital augmentation in many of the wide landscape shots because the real environment was already so alien in its scale and texture. That choice pays off. The film has a visual authenticity in its ground level desert sequences that a fully CGI environment simply could not have replicated. Keep that in mind the next time you watch a shot of those vast orange dunes stretching toward a hostile sky. The third thing, and this one genuinely changes how you read the relationship at the center of the film. Mila Jovovich and Tony Jaa reportedly did not share a common spoken language on set. Jovovich is fluent in English and Russian. Jao's primary language is Thai. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, the two actors communicated largely through gesture, physical demonstration, and the universal language of action choreography. And here is why that matters. The film asks us to believe in a relationship between two characters who cannot verbally communicate for a significant portion of the story. Most films would treat that as a logistical problem to be solved quickly. Anderson leaned into it. The dynamic between Artemis and the hunter, the wordless negotiation, the physical trust building, the gradual shift from mutual threat to mutual dependency was reportedly shaped in real time by the genuine communication challenge the actors were navigating. What looks like a creative storytelling choice on screen was also, in part, a creative solution to a real production situation, and somehow that makes those scenes feel even more earned. The fourth fact is about scale, and it is one of those details that makes you recalibrate everything you think you know about how this film was made. The monster designs in Monster Hunter are drawn directly from the games. The Diablos, the Nursilla, the Rathalos, and bringing them to life required an extraordinary collaboration between the film's visual effects team and the game's original creators at Capcom. According to production notes, Capcom was closely involved throughout the design process, signing off on how their iconic creatures would translate into photorealistic form. What this means is that when you see a Diablos burst out of the sand for the first time, that design is not a Hollywood approximation of the game creature, it is as close to a faithful translation as the medium would allow. For fans of the games, that fidelity is deeply meaningful. For newcomers, it means the creatures have an internal design logic that wasn't invented for the film. They come from a world with its own established biology and behavior, and that depth shows. And the fifth production detail, and this one is genuinely fascinating from a filmmaking craft perspective, concerns the action choreography. Tony Jaa is one of the most physically gifted action performers in world cinema. If you have seen On Buck, you already know that. What reportedly happened on the set of Monster Hunter was that Anderson gave Jaa significant creative latitude to develop the combat sequences that involve his character. According to various accounts of the production, several of the fight sequences between Jovovich and Jaa were choreographed with input from Jaa himself, drawing on his Muay Thai background and his instinct for how bodies move in conflict. That is not the standard Hollywood arrangement. Usually, a stunt coordinator designs the fight and the actors execute it. Here, one of the actors was helping design the fight, and the result is a physical authenticity and creativity in those sequences that you can actually feel. The first major fight between Artemis and the Hunter has a scrappiness, an improvised quality, a sense of two people genuinely figuring each other out through violence, and now you know exactly why it feels that way. Those 5 facts are the foundation, and now that you have them, you are ready to actually watch this film properly. So let's set the scene. Monster Hunter. Released in December 2020. Directed by Paul W.S. Anderson. Starring Mila Jovovich, Tony Jaa, D.A., Megan Good, Diego Boneta, and Ron Perlman. Based on the long-running Capcom video game franchise of the same name, the genre sits at the intersection of action, fantasy, creature feature, and survival thriller, and that is a genuinely unusual combination that doesn't always hold together, but when it does something very specific to your nervous system. At its heart, this is a portal fantasy. That is the cleanest way to describe what kind of story this is. A person from a world is transported, through no choice of their own, into a world governed by completely different rules. They do not speak the language. They do not understand the ecosystem. They are not special in the way heroes are usually special. They are simply capable and determined and human in a world that has no particular interest in their humanity. Portal fantasies live and die by how well they handle that disorientation, how much they let you feel the strangeness alongside the protagonist rather than explaining it away. Monster Hunter, at its best, does this very well. Should you watch this film? Here is my spoiler-free verdict. Yes. Particularly if you have any affection for creature features, practical feeling action, or the simple pleasure of watching two extremely capable people figure out how to survive something impossible together. This is not a film that is going to challenge your understanding of cinema. It is not trying to. What it is trying to do is give you a specific kind of visceral, grounded, visually spectacular experience. And on those terms, it largely delivers. My rating is a 7 out of 10, and I'll explain exactly what earns that rating and exactly what pulls it back as we go through this together. But first, let me tell you what watching this for the first time actually felt like. I pressed play expecting a Resident Evil spiritual successor. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about my expectations going in. Paul W.S. Anderson, Mila Jovovich, based on a video game. I had a very specific mental model of what this was going to be. Fast cut action, competent but not particularly ambitious visuals, a thin story that existed mainly as connective tissue between set pieces, and a mid-range budget stretched to look bigger than it was. That was my prediction. That was what I walked in expecting. The opening sequence challenged that prediction almost immediately. The film begins not with Artemis, not with the character we will follow. It begins with a ship, and not just any ship, A sailing vessel unlike anything in our world, moving through a storm racked sea that feels cosmically wrong, crewed by people in armor that belongs in a fantasy epic, moving towards something massive and hidden in clouds that have no right to exist in any sky you have ever seen. And before you have time to orient yourself, before you understand what world you are in or who these people are, something enormous moves beneath the water, and you realize, slowly with genuine unease, that this sea has things living in it. Big things. Things that treat this ship the way a whale treats a robot. It is about 90 seconds of screen time, and it does something very specific. It establishes the scale of this world before we ever arrive in it. We are being shown a civilization that exists in relation to monsters, not despite them, not in fear of them, in active, organized, practiced relationship with them. And that is a fundamentally different emotional setup than the usual creature feature approach of showing you the normal world before it gets interrupted. Monster Hunter shows you the abnormal world first, lets you feel the scale and the danger, and then introduces you to a person from our world who has no context for any of it. That opening hooked me immediately. The atmosphere this film creates in its first act is something I want to stay with for a moment because I think it is one of the things most critics dismiss too quickly. When Artemis and her unit first arrive in the New World, and I want to hold off on exactly how that happens for this story walkthrough, there is a dust and heat and silence to the environment that feels genuinely threatening. The desert is not just a backdrop, it is a character. It has weight and temperature and the quality of a place that will outlast everything that happens inside it. The sound design in these early scenes is particularly intelligent. The wind, the shifting sand, the distant low frequencies that suggest subterranean movement. The film is telling you through pure sensory information that something is under the ground, and it earns the payoff of that promise in a way that lands with real impact. I walked in expecting Resident Evil in a fantasy skin. The film gave me something I didn't predict, a survival story with genuine environmental dread, two central performances that create real chemistry despite almost no shared language, and a visual world that has a scope and internal consistency I wasn't ready for. Was it everything it could have been? No. Being get to that honestly. But that first hour surprised me in ways that I kept thinking about after the credits rolled. And that is exactly the kind of film the film box exists to open up properly. So let's go inside the story. Let's look at what happens, why it matters, and where this film is really trying to take you. Artemis is not a reluctant hero. That is the first thing you need to understand about her as a character, and it is the thing that separates her from almost every other portal fantasy protagonist you have seen on screen. When she arrives in the new world, and we will get to exactly how that crossing happens in a moment, she does not panic, she does not freeze, she does not spend 20 minutes of screen time asking what is happening and refusing to accept the answer. She assesses, she adapts, she moves. And that choice, made clearly and consistently from the very first moment of her arrival, is what makes the film's survival sequences work as well as they do. Let's go back to the beginning of her story and walk through this properly. We meet Artemis, Captain Natalie Artemis, United Nations military in the middle of a mission. She is leading a small unit through a desert environment on what appears to be a search and rescue operation. Her team is competent, tight, professional. There is warmth between them, but also the kind of focused discipline that comes from people who have trained together and trust each other in life or death situations. And right from these early scenes, the film is doing something that I think deserves credit. It is establishing that Artemis has something real to lose. These are not anonymous soldiers. They have faces and voices and a dynamic that feels lived in. The film gives you just enough of their relationships to make you care about what is about to happen to them. And what is about to happen to them is genuinely disorienting in the best possible way. A storm appears, not a normal storm. A storm that has an electrical quality unlike anything in atmospheric science, a color and a texture that belongs to a different sky entirely. the unit watches it approach, and before they can make any decision about what to do, the storm swallows them. One moment they are in a recognizable desert, the next moment they are somewhere else entirely. The sand is the same color, the heat is the same, but the sky is wrong, the dunes are wrong. The light has a quality that your brain registers immediately as alien, even before the film shows you why. This crossing, this portal, is handled with real restraint, and I want to give the film credit for that restraint specifically. A lesser version of this story would have spent a significant amount of time explaining the portal, how it works, what causes it, what it means, scientifically or mystically. Monster Hunter does almost none of that. It shows you the crossing, it shows you the disorientation on the other side, and then it moves forward. Because the film understands something that a lot of portal fantasies get wrong, the crossing is not the point, the arrival is the point. What you do when you are somewhere you don't understand, with no map and no instructions, is the actual story. The unit sets up position and begins trying to make sense of where they are. And here is where the film does something genuinely clever with its pacing. The danger doesn't arrive immediately. The desert is quiet. The team communicates, debates, makes tactical decisions. There is a moment of almost false calm where you think, maybe this is survivable. Maybe this world is just a different desert. Maybe the crossing was the worst of it. And then something moves onto the sand. The Diablo's reveal is one of the best creature introduction sequences in recent blockbuster filmmaking, and I want to spend some real time on it because I think it is an underappreciated piece of craft. The film does not show you the creature first, it shows you the sand. It shows you the displacement, the ripple of movement beneath the surface, the way the ground seems to breathe before it tears open. And crucially, it gives you the soldiers' reactions before it gives you the monster. You see their faces shift from confusion to alarm to full combat terror, and by the time the Diablos actually erupts from the sand, you have already experienced the emotional escalation 3 times over. Through the sound, through the ground movement, and through the faces of people who know what real danger feels like, and are suddenly telling you, with every muscle in their bodies, that this is something different. Something categorically different. The creature itself is extraordinary, massive, horn, built with a weight and musculature that suggests genuine biological plausibility. This is not a monster designed to look scary for its own sake. This is an animal, an apex predator evolved for a specific environment, and every physical attribute it has serves a function. The horns are for combat and dominance display. The thick armored hide is for burrowing through rock and sand. The low, broad body shape is for stability and power in underground movement. When you look at the Diablos through that lens as a piece of natural world building rather than as a monster designed to create maximum visual chaos, the creature design becomes genuinely impressive. Artemis's unit is destroyed rapidly, and the film does not flinch from that. This is not a film where the hero's team survives until a convenient dramatic moment. The Diablos is not something that trained soldiers with conventional weapons can meaningfully engage. They are not equipped for this world, and the film makes that point with brutal efficiency. Artemis survives not because she is the hero and heroes survive, she survives because of a specific combination of terrain and decision making and a small amount of luck. The film honors that distinction. It does not make her survival feel inevitable or easy. It makes it feel fragile and contingent. And that fragility is exactly the right emotional note for the beginning of this story. And then she is alone. The solo survival sequence that follows is, for my money, the strongest sustained filmmaking in the entire film. Artemis, alone in a desert that is actively trying to kill her, with limited ammunition, no food, no water, no communication, and no framework for understanding the rules of the world she is now inhabiting. She finds shelter in the remains of what appears to be a crashed vessel, something enormous, designed for sea travel, now half buried in sand, and this detail is worth pausing on. That crashed ship is a piece of world building that the film doesn't stop to explain. It is simply there, enormous and ancient, and clearly the remnant of something that happened long before Artemis arrived. And the fact that the film doesn't explain it tells you something important about the world you are in. This is a place with deep history that existed long before this story and will exist long after it. Inside that wreckage, Artemis finds evidence of other survivors. Someone has been here before her. Someone who had enough time and enough skill to carve out a survivable existence in this environment. The film reveals this information through objects and arrangements rather than exposition. A fire that has been used regularly, stores of food, handmade tools, and weapons. The kind of careful domestic organization that speaks of someone who decided to stay alive through pure refusal to do otherwise. And then she meets him, the hunter. Tony Jaa's character, who is never given a name in the English language version of the film, which is itself a fascinating choice, does not appear as a hero. He appears as a threat. He drops into Artemis's field of vision like something the environment itself has produced, wrapped in materials that blend with the desert, moving with an economy of motion that speaks of years in this specific landscape, carrying weapons that she has never seen and doesn't understand. And the first thing he does when he encounters her is attempt to take her supplies. What happens next is the heart of the film. It is the sequence that the entire story is built around. And it is the sequence that Tony Jaa and Mila Jovovich apparently helped develop through their real production communication challenges. Which, now that you know that behind the scenes detail, makes it hit completely differently. They fight. Not a choreographed action movie fight where two super capable people exchange impressive moves in a well lit space. A brutal, resourceful, genuinely vicious fight between two people who are terrified of each other and are both fighting with the full intention of surviving the encounter. Artemis uses her military training, her firearms, her understanding of space and tactical positioning. The hunter uses the environment, his physical gifts, his intimate knowledge of his own body and its capabilities. Neither of them has a clean advantage. The fight shifts multiple times, and crucially, neither of them wins cleanly. It ends not in victory for either party but in a kind of exhausted, injured stalemate where continuing costs more than stopping. And in that stalemate, the film finds its most interesting idea. Two people who cannot speak to each other. Two people who have every reason to remain adversaries. Two people who are, in this moment, equally stranded and equally threatened by an environment that will kill them both if they don't figure out something better. The negotiation of a ceasefire between Artemis and the hunter, conducted entirely without shared language, through gesture and demonstration and the careful offering and acceptance of small acts of good faith, food, fire, the lowering of a weapon, is the most genuinely human sequence in the film, and it earns everything that comes after it. Because what comes after is a partnership built from pure necessity and shaped slowly and carefully into something that has the texture of genuine respect. The hunter begins teaching Artemis the rules of this world. Not through speech, through demonstration. He shows her which sounds mean danger and which means safety. He shows her how the ground moves differently near a buried Diablos. He shows her the difference between the materials that matter and the materials that don't in this ecosystem. And Artemis, who is a fast learner and deeply competent, watches everything and retains it and applies it. She is not being rescued. She is being educated. And the distinction matters enormously to what this film is saying about its central character. Alongside this central relationship, the film begins revealing more of the world. We see evidence of the New Earth's human population, the Gill Hunters, an organized society that has built its entire civilization around the understanding and management of monsters. We catch glimpses of the tools and technologies they have developed, all of which are drawn from monster materials. We understand gradually that the relationship between humans and monsters in this world is not simply predator and prey, it is something more complex, more ecological. The monsters are the world's dominant organisms. Humans have found ways to exist in relationship with that dominance, carving out survival through skill and knowledge and communal organization. This world building is handled primarily visually and through implication, rather than exposition dumps. and I want to give the film significant credit for that choice. There are no lengthy scenes where a character explains the history of the new world to Artemis, and by extension to you. Instead, you learn the world the way Artemis learns it, incrementally, through direct experience, through watching how the hunter moves and what he pays attention to and what he avoids. It is immersive world building of the first order, and it is one of the most underrated aspects of this film. The second major creature that the film introduces is the Nerscylla, a spider like organism of enormous scale that inhabits the rock formations above the desert. The sequence in which Artemis and the hunter are forced to navigate through Nerscylla territory is a masterclass in sustained tension. The creature is designed with a specific, deeply uncomfortable quality. It is fast in a way that feels wrong, moving across vertical surfaces with a physicality that triggers something primal in the viewer. The film uses darkness and partial visibility to maximize the dread of these sequences, showing you just enough of the Nerscylla to understand its scale and speed before the full reveal. And the full reveal, when it comes, is genuinely startling. Not because it is grotesque, but because of how it moves. The motion design on the Nerscylla is among the best creature work in the film. Throughout these survival sequences, the relationship between Artemis and the hunter continues to develop in ways that feel earned rather than expedient. There is a chocolate bar sequence, and I am deliberately being somewhat vague here to preserve the experience for anyone who hasn't seen it. That is one of the most quietly charming moments in the entire film. Two warriors from different worlds, united briefly by the simple pleasure of something sweet. It is a tiny moment. It lasts maybe 45 seconds, and it does more for the audience's investment in these two characters than any amount of action choreography could have achieved. The film knows this. It places the moment, deliberately, at a point in the story where the emotional stakes of their survival together are beginning to settle into something that feels real. Now, let me tell you about the point where the film opens up entirely and shifts the scale of everything that came before. Artemis and the hunter, having survived the Nerscylla and established a functional partnership, begin moving toward what the hunter understands as safety, the territory controlled by the guild hunters. And as they travel, the film begins preparing you for something. The sound design starts changing, the horizon starts looking different. The hunter's behavior, which has been precise and controlled throughout, takes on a quality of heightened alertness that you recognize by now as his response to genuine danger. And then, rising above the distant rock formations, something moves that makes everything you have seen before look small. The Rathalos, the flagship monster of the Monster Hunter franchise, the creature that has been on the game's cover art for decades, the iconic flying wyvern that defines the franchise's identity, arrives in the film in a way that is genuinely cinematic, not as a sudden action sequence surprise, as a presence, something that exists at the edge of the frame for a moment before it fully enters it, the way that something enormous moves when it is not yet aware of you. The scale of the creature against the landscape is staggering, and the sound it makes, a cry that the sound designers reportedly built from multiple layered recordings of real animals, processed and combined into something that exists nowhere in nature, lands in your chest. This is the moment a box opens completely. Because the arrival of the Rathalos is not just a spectacle moment, it is the film's declaration that everything before this point was prologue. The real world of Monster Hunter. The world of apex creatures, of legendary hunts, of hunters who have dedicated their entire lives to understanding and engaging organisms of this scale, is now fully present. And Artemis, who has survived the Diablos and the Nerscylla through skill and determination and a growing understanding of this world's rules, now faces something that the hunter himself, a seasoned veteran of this world, approaches with something very close to reverence. The sequence that follows the arrival at the Guild Hunters territory, the introduction of the Admiral, played by Ron Perlman, the broader community of hunters that Artemis encounters for the first time, is the film shifting gears from intimate survival drama to something with a larger scope. And this is honestly where the film becomes slightly less sure of itself. But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you what this film does genuinely brilliantly well. The central performance of this film belongs to Mila Jovovich, and it is a significantly better piece of work than the film received credit for. The critical conversation around Jovovich's performance in Monster Hunter largely focused on whether her casting was the result of her marriage to the director, a tired and somewhat unfair framing that sidesteps what she actually does on screen. What she actually does is this. She carries 20 plus minutes of screen time with minimal dialogue in physically demanding conditions opposite a co star she cannot verbally communicate with, and she makes you believe completely in a character who exists at the absolute edge of her capabilities and refuses to break. The specific scene that proves this, the scene I want you to think about if you've already seen the film, is the sequence where Artemis is alone in the wreckage after losing her unit. No dialogue, no external action, just Jovovich sitting in the quiet of a dead desert world, processing the full weight of what has just happened. It is about 90 seconds of pure internal performance. And in those 90 seconds, she communicates grief and shock and the conscious decision to not let those things stop her, and she does it without a single word. That is acting. Full stop. The machinery of her face and body in that moment is doing something that deserves far more recognition than it received. Tony Jaa brings something equally specific and equally valuable to the film. The hunter is a character who exists almost entirely in physical expression. There is no dialogue to rely on, no exposition about his backstory, no scene where someone explains who he is or what he has been through. Everything you understand about him comes from how he moves, how he occupies space, how he relates to his environment. Jaa gives the hunter a quality of complete presence that is extremely difficult to achieve on screen. When the hunter is in a scene, you watch him. Not because he is doing something dramatic, often because he is doing something very small, very precise, very specific to the world he inhabits. He makes the world feel real by his relationship to it, and that is a gift that very few action performers have. The visual direction of this film deserves a serious conversation because I think it was significantly undersold by critical discourse at the time. Paul W.S. Anderson is a director who has never been a critical darling, and I think there is some genuine unfairness in how his visual intelligence is consistently dismissed. Monster Hunter contains some of the most striking large-scale desert cinematography in recent blockbuster filmmaking. The composition of the wide shots, the way human figures are placed against the overwhelming scale of the landscape, consistently communicates something thematically essential. In this world, humans are not the apex entity. The environment itself is the dominant presence. Every frame that shows you a tiny Artemis against a vast orange dune or a distant mountainous skyline is reinforcing the film's central emotional proposition. You are not in control here. You are a visitor. You survive by understanding the rules, not by imposing your own. The monster CGI exists on a spectrum within the film. The Diablos is exceptional. Its burrowing movement and the physical impact of its attacks create a sense of genuine mass and force that holds up to scrutiny even in close shots. The Ursula is slightly less consistent but handles well in its best sequences. The Rathalos is spectacular in terms of scale and motion, but occasionally shows its digital origins in shots where it interacts closely with physical elements of the set. This is a budget reality rather than a creative failure. The film was made for approximately $60 million, which for the scale of creature content it is attempting is genuinely challenging, but it does create occasional visual inconsistency that affects immersion. The sound design and score are areas where the film punches significantly above its weight class. The sonic identity of the new world is built from layers that reward attention. There are low-frequency elements in nearly every desert scene that suggest subterranean movement even when nothing is visibly happening, which creates a sustained undercurrent of unease that the film rides beautifully. The score, composed by Paul Haslinger, favors texture and atmosphere over traditional melodic themes. It does not give you an iconic musical motif to carry out of the cinema. What it does instead is create an immersive sonic landscape that never conflicts with the visual environment and consistently reinforces the emotional temperature of each sequence. In a film about an alien world, the music sounds alien. That is a more sophisticated approach than it might initially appear. The single most unforgettable sequence in the film, and I want to be specific here because I think it is genuinely worth singling out, is the first Diablo's emergence. Not the action sequence that follows, the emergence itself, that 5 to 8 seconds of sand beginning to move, of the desert surface becoming suddenly, horribly, living, is one of the most effectively executed creature reveal moments in recent memory. It is constructed with the precision of someone who understands that anticipation is more powerful than arrival. The sand moves, the sound changes, the soldiers freeze, and then pure kinetic chaos. The construction of that sequence, the deliberate placement of calm before catastrophe, the use of sonic and visual information to build a dread response in the viewer before the payoff lands, that is filmmaking craft that deserves genuine recognition. Now let me talk honestly about where Monster Hunter falls short, because 7 out of 10 means something earned that score and something pulled it back. And fair criticism requires looking clearly at both. The film's most significant structural problem is its second act transition. The arrival at the Guild Hunters territory, the introduction of Ron Perlman's Admiral and the broader world of organized monster hunting, should feel like the story opening up into something larger and more complex. And for a brief period, it does. The site of the hunter community, of the equipment and culture and social organization that has developed around living in proximity to these creatures, is genuinely fascinating. But the film moves through this world too quickly, and with insufficient interest in the human stories inside it. Ron Perlman's Admiral is given almost nothing to do except be authoritative and occasionally explain things. He is a presence rather than a character, and given that Perlman is one of the most naturally charismatic performers in American cinema, that waste is genuinely frustrating. The supporting characters across the entire film are significantly underdeveloped, and this is a real limitation. Artemis's unit, the soldiers who travel with her through the portal, exist primarily to be in danger and then to not be in danger anymore. We get fragments of their personalities in the opening sequences, enough to register them as human beings, but not enough to make their fates land with the weight they should. A film that spends more time with these characters before the portal crossing would have earned a significantly more powerful emotional response when things go wrong for them. The story knows this is a limitation. You can feel it in the early scenes, where the script reaches for character detail but doesn't quite have the runtime to develop it properly. The pacing in the film's third act is the other major issue, and it is connected to the structural problem I mentioned. The film builds beautifully toward the Rathalos confrontation. That confrontation is earned and spectacular and delivers on the scale it promises. But everything that happens after that confrontation feels rushed in a way that suggests the film ran out of either budget or runtime or both. The final act should be an expansion of everything the film has been building: the relationship between Artemis and the hunter, the question of whether she can return to her own world, the larger implications of two worlds being connected by a portal. Instead, it accelerates to a resolution that feels less like a climax and more like a transition point for a sequel that may or may not ever arrive. And this is, I think, the film's most fundamental creative problem. Monster Hunter is structured as the first act of a larger story rather than as a complete narrative in its own right. The film establishes a world, establishes relationships, establishes stakes, and then the credits roll before those stakes have been fully resolved. For an audience that came to this film without a deep investment in the game franchise, that incomplete feeling is a real obstacle to satisfaction. The film asks you to invest in its world and its characters, and then it hands you a story that ends at what feels like the midpoint of the journey it set up. This is a criticism of the creative strategy, not of the craft within the film. The individual sequences, the survival drama, the creature encounters, the central relationship are well executed, but a collection of well executed sequences that don't add up to a complete narrative arc is a structural problem that no amount of visual spectacle can fully compensate for. The tonal inconsistency in the film's final section is also worth naming. The film spends most of its runtime establishing a specific emotional register, intimate, grounded, survival focused, with a kind of hushed seriousness about the danger of the world it is depicting. And then in the final sequence, it shifts to something more conventionally action oriented, more kinetic, more visually extravagant. The tonal shift is not disqualifying, but it creates a slight discontinuity, a feeling that the film you are watching in the first hour has become a slightly different film in the final 30 minutes. Not a bad film, but a different one. T.A.'s character, one of Artemis's unit members, is a performance that is serviceable in the moment, but who exists in the story primarily as a functional plot element rather than a full character. In a film that is otherwise willing to invest in the emotional reality of its central figures, this underdevelopment stands out. It is not a performance failure, it is a writing and one-time allocation problem. Finally, the logic of the portal and its mechanics is deliberately left unexplained, which I defended earlier as a creative choice. But there are moments in the later portions of the film where that deliberate vagueness begins to feel less like restraint and more like avoidance, where a single line of dialogue establishing the basic rules of how and when the portal operates would have resolved questions that the film allows to hang unresolved in a way that creates minor but persistent narrative friction. The balance between productive mystery and frustrating ambiguity is one that the film navigates well in its first half and slightly less well in its second. None of these criticisms fundamentally undermine the film's best qualities, but they are real and they are the honest reason that Monster Hunter sits at a 7 rather than somewhere higher. It is a film that earns its best moments completely and then makes choices in its structure and character development that prevent it from being the thing it could have been with slightly different priorities. What remains after all of that is a film that I want to keep talking about. A film that created a world I genuinely wanted to spend more time in. A film that gave me two central performances I believed in and a visual landscape that has stayed with me. A film that at its best reminded me of something that blockbuster cinema sometimes forgets. That scale is only impressive if you have earned the intimacy first. Monster Hunter earned the intimacy first, and then it showed you something enormous. And that sequence of events, the small before the vast, is why the film works as well as it does, even with its limitations fully acknowledged. Now I want to step back from the film itself for a moment. Because Monster Hunter did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in December of 2020. And if you are alive and paying attention in December of 2020, you already know that the context surrounding this film's release was unlike anything the cinema industry had experienced in living memory. Understanding that context is not a footnote to the film's story. It is essential to understanding why the film was received the way it was, why its audience found it the way they did, and why its reputation has shifted so significantly in the years since. So let's open this layer up carefully, because there is a lot inside it. December 2020, the global cinema industry was in free fall. The pandemic had shuttered theaters worldwide for months earlier in the year, and while some markets had cautiously reopened by the time Monster Hunter was released, attendance was a fraction of pre-pandemic levels. Audiences were nervous about enclosed spaces. Cinemas in major markets were operating at severely reduced capacity. The social infrastructure that normally surrounds a big blockbuster release, the midnight screenings, the packed opening weekends, the word of mouth that spreads through communities of people who all watched the same film on the same night, was simply absent. Monster Hunter was released into a world where the communal experience of cinema had been fundamentally disrupted, and that disruption shaped everything about how the film was initially received. Consider what it means practically for a film of this type to be released in that environment. Monster Hunter is a creature featured blockbuster. It is designed to be experienced in a large, dark room with a powerful sound system and an audience of strangers who collectively gasp and hold their breath and laugh with relief together. The Diablo's immersion sequence, which I described in detail earlier as a masterclass of sustained tension, that sequence is engineered for a cinema environment. The low-frequency sound design, the visual scale, the communal rhythm of an audience moving through the tension and release together. When you watch that sequence alone on a laptop in your living room, or even on a decent television, you are experiencing a version of it. You are not experiencing it as it was designed to be experienced, and that gap between intended experience and actual delivery conditions is not the film's fault. But it absolutely affected how people felt about it when it first came out. The critical reception was, to put it generously, mixed. Monster Hunter sits at around 44% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, which sounds damning until you look more carefully at what critics were actually saying. The negative reviews were not uniformly arguing that the film was incompetent or without value. Many of them were arguing that it was shallow, that it prioritized spectacle over story, that it felt like a first chapter rather than a complete film. These are real criticisms that I have already engaged with honestly. But what is interesting is the degree to which those criticisms reflected the specific conditions of pandemic era film criticism. Rushed viewing in non optimal conditions, a critical community that was itself exhausted and disoriented, and an implicit standard of what a blockbuster should deliver that was increasingly out of step with what audiences actually wanted from cinema in a period of profound collective stress. Because here is the thing about audience reception, and this divergence is genuinely fascinating to dig into. While critics were giving Monster Hunter middling reviews, audiences were responding to it quite differently. The audience score on Rotten Tomatoes sits considerably higher than the critic score, hovering around 65 to 70%, depending on when you look, which represents a significant divergence from critical consensus. And the nature of the audience reaction is telling. People who came to this film as fans of the video game franchise were, on the whole, more forgiving of its structural limitations and more appreciative of its creature design fidelity and world-building authenticity. People who came to it as fans of the Resident Evil films, who had relationship with the Anderson Jovovich creative partnership, responded positively to the familiar dynamics and the physical commitment of the performances. People who came to it with no prior context and simply wanted a creature feature with genuine spectacle and a central relationship they could invest in found exactly that. The critical audience divergence on Monster Hunter is, I think, a genuinely interesting case study in what different groups of people are looking for from this type of film. Critics were evaluating it against a standard of narrative completeness and thematic depth that the film was not primarily trying to achieve. Audiences were evaluating it against a standard of entertainment, spectacle, and emotional investment, and finding that the film delivered on those terms more consistently than the reviews suggested. Neither group was wrong in its own terms. But the divergence reveals something important about how genre cinema gets evaluated, and about whether the frameworks critics apply to blockbusters are always the right frameworks for understanding what those films are actually trying to do. There is also a specific controversy worth addressing here, because it became a significant part of the conversation around the film's release, and pretending it didn't happen would be intellectually dishonest. Early in the theatrical run of Monster Hunter, a brief comedic exchange between two characters, a moment that was intended as throwaway humor, was flagged as containing language that was offensive and racially insensitive in certain cultural contexts. The film was pulled from Chinese theaters almost immediately after its release there, representing a significant financial loss given the scale of the Chinese market for action blockbusters. The scene in question was subsequently edited or removed in various distribution contexts. I am raising this not to dwell on it, but because it was a real part of the film's release story, and because it affected the film's commercial performance in ways that contributed to the narrative of failure that surrounded its initial run. The creative decision that led to that moment was a misjudgment. The consequences were significant, and the speed with which the studio moved to address it reflects both the seriousness of the error and the commercial reality of the situation. Commercially, Monster Hunter's theatrical performance was modest. It grossed approximately around $45 to $50 million worldwide in theatrical release, numbers that in normal circumstances would represent a disappointment for a $60 million production. But the circumstances were not normal, and evaluating the film's commercial performance against standard box office benchmarks misses the full picture. The film moved to home video and streaming relatively quickly, and it was in that environment that its audience found it most naturally. On streaming platforms, and reportedly on physical media sales as well, Monster Hunter performed significantly above expectations. The film became one of those titles that circulated through recommendations and genre communities and gaming communities in a way that slowly but steadily built a genuine fan base. People who might never have driven to a cinema in December 2020 to see a video game adaptation were perfectly willing to spend a quiet evening on the couch with it, and many of them came away more impressed than the reviews had led them to expect. This streaming second life is a phenomenon that deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of film success and failure. A film's theatrical opening weekend number is a measure of a specific kind of cultural moment, the moment of arrival, the moment of communal excitement. But a film's streaming longevity is a measure of something different, of whether the film has genuine rewatch value, genuine word of mouth momentum, and a core audience that returns to it and recommends it over time. Monster Hunter, on those terms, has been a quiet success story. In terms of awards, Monster Hunter received no significant recognition from the major critical awards bodies, which is entirely predictable given its critical reception and its genre positioning. However, it is worth noting that the film's visual effects work, its creature design, and its production design all represent genuine achievements that exist below the threshold of awards attention largely because of genre bias rather than merit. The Diablos, in particular, represents a creature design and visual effects execution that sits comfortably alongside the creature work in films that do receive technical awards recognition. The lack of awards attention for this category of crafting genre blockbusters is a long-standing and arguably unfair aspect of how the awards landscape functions. Does Monster Hunter feel timeless or perfectly of its era? This is a question I find genuinely interesting to think about. In some ways, the film is very specifically a product of its moment. It reflects a particular phase in the evolution of video game adaptations, a period when studios were still figuring out how to translate gaming franchises to screen without either over-explaining the lore for fans or leaving newcomers completely adrift. The balance Monster Hunter strikes between those two failure modes is imperfect, but it is a more thoughtful balance than many of its contemporaries managed. In that sense, it is a document of a specific transitional moment in Hollywood's relationship with gaming IP. But in other ways, the film's core elements have a quality that transcends their moment. The central survival relationship. Two people with no shared language building trust through action and mutual necessity is a narrative structure that has existed in storytelling for as long as humans have told stories. The spectacle of enormous creatures realized with genuine craft and visual imagination is something that never stops having power, because the human fascination with scale and otherness is not culturally contingent. And the desert landscape with its timeless geological scale drowns the film in something that will look as striking in 20 years as it does today. I think Monster Hunter sits in an underexplored category. Films that are better than their cultural reputation, that contain genuine craft and imagination, that were released into circumstances that prevented them from finding their proper audience at the right moment, and that are slowly being reassessed as that audience discovers them outside the pressures of the original release context. The conversation around this film in gaming communities and genre communities has been noticeably warmer in recent years than it was in 2020. People are returning to it and finding more in it than the early reviews suggested. And that trajectory, the quiet upward curve of a film finding its people over time, is in many ways the most honest measure of whether a film has lasting value. Now I want to go deeper, past the production story and the cultural context, and into the territory that I find most rewarding. The question of what this film is actually about underneath all the sand and scale and creature design. Because Monster Hunter is not a complex film in terms of narrative structure, but it is doing something more interesting beneath its surface than it is typically given credit for. Let's sit with this for a moment and really open it up. On the surface, Monster Hunter is a story about a soldier who crosses into another world and has to learn the rules of that world in order to survive. That is a clean, functional premise. But what does that premise actually mean? What is it a story about in the way that stories are always about something beyond their literal events? I want to start with the character of Artemis because she is the key to understanding what the film is really doing thematically. Artemis is, at the beginning of the film, a person who operates within clearly defined systems. She is a military officer. She has a chain of command. She has protocols and procedures and a clear framework for understanding her role and the roles of the people around her. She is competent within that system, highly competent. But all of her competence is contingent on the system being present. Take away the system and you take away the framework within which her skills make sense. The portal crossing does exactly that. It does not make Artemis less capable, but it places her in an environment where the specific form of her capability, her military training, her procedure knowledge, her understanding of chains of command and tactical frameworks is essentially useless. In the new world, her combat skills still function, her ability to read terrain still functions, her physical endurance and her willingness to keep moving when everything is telling her to stop. These still function, but all of the organizational and institutional scaffolding around those core attributes is gone. She is a soldier with no army, no mission, no chain of command, no protocol for what is happening to her. And what the film is quietly exploring in this premise is the question of what a person actually is when you remove the systems they rely on to define themselves. Artemis does not have an identity crisis in the film. She is too pragmatic and too focused on immediate survival for existential questioning. But the film is asking the question on her behalf. Who is she really when the soldier's identity is stripped away? The answer the film arrives at, gradually and without announcing itself, is this: she is someone who refuses to stop, not because of military training, not because of duty or obligation, but because of something deeper than those things, a core of pure, stubborn aliveness that has nothing to do with rank or mission or institutional identity. And that is actually a genuinely interesting thing for an action blockbuster to be about. The stripping away of social identity to reveal essential self. The discovery that what you are underneath the titles and roles and uniforms is in some ways more real and more fundamental than the constructed identity you had before. Artemis becomes more herself in the new world than she was in her own world. Not because the new world is better, it is objectively more dangerous and less comfortable in every measurable way, but because it demands that she operate from her actual core rather than from the institutional scaffolding around it. The hunter, as a counterpoint to this, is a person who has already arrived at what Artemis is discovering. He has no visible institutional identity. He has no army, no title, no rank. He has skills and experience and a deep embodied knowledge of his world. He is, in a sense, what Artemis is in the process of becoming, a person whose identity is entirely intrinsic rather than externally conferred. The dynamic between them is not simply experienced veteran and confused newcomer. It is a meeting between someone who has already arrived at the end of a journey and someone who has just been forced to begin it. This is, I think, why the wordless communication between them works as well as it does thematically. Language is a social technology. It is the primary mechanism through which institutions and systems organize human beings and define relationships between them. When you remove language from a relationship, you remove a significant amount of the social architecture that normally structures human interaction. What remains is more fundamental. Gesture, action, physical presence, the direct communication of bodies in space. Artemis and the hunter have to build their relationship from that more fundamental level, bypassing all of the social technology that normally mediates human connection. And what they find there: the capacity for trust, for teaching and learning, for the recognition of another person's capability and value, is not dependent on language or shared culture or institutional role. It is just human, simply, purely, fundamentally human. That is a quiet but real thing for a blockbuster to be saying, and it lands because the film never says it out loud. It does not announce its theme, it simply builds a situation in which the theme is the only possible conclusion and trusts you to arrive there yourself. The monster ecology of the New World carries its own thematic weight, and I want to spend some time on this because I think it is consistently overlooked in discussions of the film. The monsters in Monster Hunter are not evil. This is one of the most important things the film establishes, and it does so almost entirely through visual information rather than dialogue. The Diablos is not hunting Artemis maliciously, it is a territorial animal responding to the presence of something in its territory. The Nersila is not pursuing them with vendetta, it is a predator following the logic of predation. Even the Rathalos, which is the film's largest and most devastating creature, is not presented as a force of darkness or malevolence. It is an apex organism operating within the logic of its ecology. This matters because it places the film in a tradition of creature narratives that is fundamentally different from the monster as evil metaphor tradition. The creatures in Monster Hunter are not stand-ins for human evil or moral failure. They are the world. They are what the world is made of at its most fundamental and powerful level. And the human response to them, the guild hunter's approach of study, understanding, respect, and engagement rather than simply extermination, reflects a relationship with the natural world that is, underneath all the fantasy elements, recognizably ecological in its philosophy. There is something genuinely contemporary about this. In a cultural moment when the relationship between human civilization and the natural world is increasingly understood as one of the defining challenges of our era, a blockbuster that presents enormous, powerful natural organisms not as enemies to be defeated but as forces to be understood and related to is making a statement that goes beyond its genre. The hunter does not hate the monsters he hunts. He respects them. He studies them. He engages with them according to principles developed over generations of hard-won understanding. His community has built its entire civilization on the premise that these creatures are the dominant force in their world and that the only viable human response is not to dominate in return, but to find a way to exist in relationship with that dominance. Artemis arrives from a world. Our world, the dominant human approach to the natural environment has been exactly the opposite of this. She arrives from a world of hierarchy and control and the institutional management of natural forces. And the new world asks her, immediately and without apology, to abandon that framework entirely and learn a different one. Her arc in the film is not from weakness to strength. It is from one relationship with the world to another, from control to coexistence, from the management of nature to the navigation of it. That is a quietly radical thing for a blockbuster to be doing in 2020. And the fact that it does it without ever becoming preachy or self-congratulatory, without ever stopping to tell you that this is what it is doing, is a real creative achievement. The theme lives entirely in the action and the visual world rather than in dialogue or exposition. You feel it before you can articulate it. And that is exactly how the best thematic storytelling works. There is one more thematic thread I want to pull before we move into the full spoiler section, and it is the most personal one. Monster Hunter, at its most human level, is a film about what it means to be understood by someone who has no way of explaining themselves to you. The language barrier between Artemis and the hunter is not a comedic obstacle or a temporary inconvenience, it is the central condition of their relationship for most of the film. They cannot tell each other their stories, they cannot explain their histories, their motivations, their fears, their reasons for the choices they make. They can only demonstrate, they can only act, they can only be present in the ways that their bodies and their actions allow. And what the film discovers in this limitation is something that I think resonates with a feeling that most people have had at some point in their lives, the experience of being with someone and understanding them completely in a way that has nothing to do with what either of you has said. The experience of trust that develops not through conversation but through shared action, shared risk, shared necessity. The recognition of another person's quality, their courage, their skill, their fundamental reliability that comes not from what they tell you about themselves, but from what you watch them do when things are difficult. In a world saturated with language, with constant communication, with the pressure to explain and justify and articulate every dimension of every experience, Monster Hunter quietly argues for the value of something pre-linguistic, something more direct, something that exists in the space between two people who are trying to survive together and have discovered, through the simple fact of their mutual survival, that they can trust each other completely. That is genuinely moving, and it is genuinely true. And the fact that it is wrapped in a blockbuster about giant desert monsters makes it no less real. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Good, you're back. And now we can actually talk about everything. Let me walk you through the complete story from beginning to end with all the details and observations and hidden layers that I held back until now. And I want to do this not as a recap but as a genuine excavation, pulling up everything that the film planted and examining what it means and why it was placed where it was. The film's opening, which I described earlier as beginning with a ship in a storm, is doing something very specific that becomes much more meaningful once you know the full story. That ship, the one we see moving through the impossible storm, crewed by hunters moving towards something monstrous in clouds that look wrong, is the same type of vessel that we see partially buried in the desert later in the film. The crashed ship that Artemis uses as shelter, the ship where she discovers evidence of a previous survivor, is a guild hunter vessel. It crossed through the same type of portal that Artemis crosses through, and the implication which the film leaves as an implication rather than spelling it out is that the connection between the worlds has happened before, multiple times, over a long period of time. The wreckage in the desert is not an anomaly, it is evidence of a pattern. This is a piece of world building that rewards attentive viewers enormously because it shifts the film's premise from accidental unique event to something more systemic and potentially more threatening. Artemis didn't stumble into a connection between worlds that had never existed before. She stumbled into a connection that has existed for long enough that there is a crashed ship half buried under 5 million-year-old dunes. The question of how many times this crossing has happened and what the consequences of those crossings have been is left deliberately open. But the visual evidence is there for anyone who wants to find it. The portal mechanism itself is tied to the Sky Tower, a massive structure visible in the distant landscape of the New World, ancient and clearly not of natural origin, that functions as the anchor point for the dimensional crossings. The film establishes that the portals are not random or chaotic. They are connected to this structure, which means they are in principle controllable. Someone or something built the Sky Tower. And the fact that this structure exists, engineered, deliberate, old, means that the connection between worlds was not an accident at any point in history. It was made. The implications of this are vast, and the film deliberately does not resolve them, which is one of the places where the incomplete first chapter feeling I described earlier is most acutely felt. Let me talk about the unit deaths in detail now, because I want to revisit them with full context. Artemis's team is destroyed in stages rather than all at once, and the staging of those deaths is more purposeful than it might initially appear. The first casualties occur in the initial Diablos encounter. The two soldiers who are caught in the open when the creature emerges are gone before anyone can respond, and the speed and finality of their deaths establishes an immediate and unambiguous rule: in this world there is no cavalry coming. There is no rescue, there is no cavalry. If you are in the wrong place when something this large decides to move, the story ends for you immediately, without ceremony. The deaths that follow, the unit being picked off by the nursery in the darkness of the rock structures, are handled with a different tonal quality. The near Scylla sequences use confined spaces and limited visibility to create a horror atmosphere that is quite distinct from the open desert scale of the Diablos encounters. And the film is doing this distinction deliberately. The new world has more than one kind of danger, and each type of danger requires a completely different emotional and tactical response. Scale and openness requires one kind of awareness. Darkness and confinement requires another. The monsters are not interchangeable. The world has ecology, and ecology means specialization, and specialization means that surviving in this world requires understanding not just that there are threats, but what kind of threats they are and how each specific kind operates. The soldier who survives longest, who makes it furthest into the film before the new world claims them, is, I would argue, the one whose death the film handles with the most restraint and the most emotional weight. The film does not show you the death directly, it shows you the aftermath, the evidence of what happened, the physical reality of absence. And it is in that restraint that the film demonstrates the most genuine respect for the human beings inside the adventure. The aftermath of violence can be more devastating than the violence itself, because the aftermath is what you have to live with. The monster is gone, the person is gone. What remains is the quiet, terrible fact of that absence. For Artemis, each death is a compound loss that the film tracks through Jovati's performance rather than through that expression. She does not break down, she does not stop, but you can read in her face and body a progressive accumulation of weight that tells you exactly how much she is carrying by the time she reaches the guild hunter's territory. The soldier has become someone else, someone who has absorbed the cost of this world and decided to carry it and keep moving anyway. And that transformation, gradual, embodied, never announced, is the quiet emotional spine of the film's first two acts. Now let me talk about the hunter's backstory, which the film handles entirely through implication and visual information, and which becomes significantly richer when you read those implications carefully. The hunter has been in the new world long enough to develop skills and knowledge that speak of years of sustained survival. His shelter, his tools, his weapons, everything about his material existence speaks of a person who arrived in this world with nothing and built a survivable life through pure ingenuity and determination. But here is what the film implies and never states. The hunter also came from somewhere else. The items in his shelter include things that do not belong to the new world's material culture. Small personal objects, things you carry with you because they mean something, not because they are useful. These objects are from his world. They are from wherever he came from before he was in the new world. This implication that the hunter is himself a traveler, himself displaced, himself someone who once stood where Artemis now stands and chose to survive rather than despair, is the key to understanding why he responds to Artemis the way he does. He does not encounter her as an alien curiosity or a tactical problem to be solved. He encounters her as someone he recognizes, someone who has just had her world taken away from her and is standing in the ruins of that loss, deciding what to do next. He has been there, he knows what that looks like, and his decision to teach her rather than simply exploit her or eliminate her is not just pragmatic, it is deeply personal. It is an act of solidarity between people who have survived the same fundamental experience. This backstory is never confirmed explicitly in the film. It is present in objects and behavior and the quality of Tony Ya's performance in the moments when he looks at Artemis with something that is not quite sympathy and not quite recognition but exists in the space between those things. It rewards attention, and it makes the relationship between these two characters significantly more layered than a surface reading reveals. The introduction of Ron Perlman's armor and the Guild Hunter community is the point where the film's ambitions and its execution begin to diverge most noticeably, and I want to be specific about why. The Guild Hunters are, in concept, one of the most interesting elements of the Monster Hunter world. A society organized around the study and engagement of apex creatures, with a culture, technology, and value system shaped entirely by the demands of that relationship. There is an enormous amount of fascinating material in the idea of this society. The film gives you a glimpse of it, the equipment, the communication between hunters, the evident hierarchy and mutual respect within the community, but does not give you enough time to actually understand it as a functioning human world. Paramount's Admiral is a character who, in a richer version of this film, would have a full arc of his own, someone who initially sees Artemis as a threat or an inconvenience and comes to recognize her as a genuine asset, someone whose relationship with the hunter tells us something about the culture and values of the guild. Instead, the Admiral is present primarily to deliver exposition about the Rathalos and the Sky Tower, to authorize the film's final act, and to be impressive in the way that Ron Perlman is always impressive by simply occupying space with his particular quality of weathered authority. None of that is the performer's fault. The script does not give him the material he would need to be a fully realized character, and you feel that absence. Here is a detail that most people miss on a first watch, and that hits very differently on a second viewing. When Artemis first arrives at the Guild Hunters settlement and is being observed by the community, there is a moment where one of the hunters, a veteran, someone who has clearly been in this world a long time, looks at her with a very specific expression. Not hostility, not curiosity, something closer to grief. The film does not explain this look. It is a fraction of a second of screen time, but in the context of the film's larger world building, in the context of the crashed ship in the desert, in the context of the implication that crossings between worlds have happened before, that look is legible as recognition. This hunter has seen someone in Artemis's position before, someone who crossed over, and the grief in that look tells you what usually happens to people in that position. It is a tiny, quiet piece of storytelling that the film trusts you to find, and I love that it is there. The preparation for the Rathalos confrontation is the film's most extended action-building sequence, and it is worth examining not just as spectacle but as character revelation. The way the guild hunters prepare for an engagement of this scale, the equipment they select, the tactical positions they establish, the specific roles each hunter takes, and the clear communication about who does what and when reveals a culture of deep professionalism and mutual trust. These are people who have survived by being extraordinarily good at a specific and dangerous craft, and the film conveys that through behavior rather than declaration. You understand that these people are excellent, not because anyone tells you they are excellent, but because you watch them operate, and the evidence is in the operation itself. Artemis's integration into this preparation is handled with a care that I think deserves recognition. The film does not have her immediately accepted as an equal by the guild hunters. That would be narratively false and thematically dishonest. She is a stranger from another world with skills that map only partially onto what this engagement requires. The guild hunters work with her rather than for her or around her. She occupies a functional role in the plan rather than a heroic one. And this positioning keeps the Finn honest about where she actually is in her development. She has learned enough of this world's rules to be useful, but she has not become the hunter. She is not yet the hunter. She is someone who has been taught enough to survive and contribute. The full transformation the film is tracing is not complete, and the film does not pretend it is. The Rathalos sequence itself, let me give this the attention it deserves, because it is the film's most ambitious piece of filmmaking, and it is the place where the production's ambitions and budget are in most visible tension with each other. The Rathalos as a visual and physical presence is extraordinary. The creature's scale against the landscape, the way it moves between ground and air, the specific quality of its fire attack, a cone of directed flame that has a temperature and texture to it that feel genuinely threatening rather than generically spectacular. All of this represents the best the film's visual effects team achieved. The creature commands attention in every frame it occupies. And crucially, the Rathalos has behavioral logic. It is not simply attacking because the plot requires it to attack. It is behaving according to a consistent set of instincts and territorial imperatives that the film has established to the earlier creature encounters. The Rathalos is present because the Sky Tower is in its territory and something is happening at the Sky Tower that it is responding to. This behavioral grounding, this sense that the creature has reasons for what it is doing, is what separates good creature filmmaking from merely spectacular creature filmmaking. The collaborative nature of the engagement. Artemis and the hunter and the guild hunters working together, each using their specific capabilities, each covering the other's limitations, is the thematic fulfillment of everything the film has been building. The military unit at the beginning of the film operated as a coherent whole within a familiar system. That system was destroyed in the New World. What the film has been tracing through the survival sequences and the language barrier and the gradual education of Artemis by the hunter is the construction of a new kind of unit, not one defined by institutional structure or shared language or common cultural background. A unit defined by shared experience, mutual respect, demonstrated competence, and the kind of trust that can only be built in crisis. The Rathalos engagement is the test of that new unit, and a pass is the test. The moment in the Rathalos sequence that I want to highlight specifically, and this is a detail that most people describe as simply cool without examining why it works so well, is the sequence where Artemis uses a combination of her own world's tools and the new world's materials and methods. She is in this moment not purely a soldier from our world and not purely a student of the hunter's world. She is both. She has both. She has integrated the two frameworks. She has become something that neither world produced independently. Someone who can navigate the new world using the best of both what she came in with and what she learned here. That indication is the completion of her arc. She is not who she was at the beginning of the film. She is not who the hunter is. She is something new that this specific journey created. And that is exactly what a character arc is supposed to produce. The Sky Tower sequence, the film's climactic set piece, is where the structural incompleteness of the film is most keenly felt. Everything in the film has been building toward a confrontation with the question of the portal, the connection between worlds and what it means for both worlds that this connection exists. And the film approaches that question and then not quite answers it. The Sky Tower is accessed. The Rathalos is engaged at the tower. And then something happens that shifts the story in a direction that clearly sets up a sequel rather than resolving the questions the film itself has been asking. Here is exactly what happens and why it matters. In the climax of the Sky Tower sequence, the portal activates again, and through it, partially, incompletely, something crosses back. Artemis, in the chaos of the engagement with the Rathalos, finds herself partly through the portal, one foot in each world, literally and figuratively. And in this moment, the film gives you its most visually arresting image, the collision of the two worlds in a single frame, the desert and the blue sky and the military vehicles of our world visible through the tear in reality that the Sky Tower has created. And then a piece of the Rathalos crosses through. This is the film's defining narrative gesture, and it is the moment that most clearly signals the incomplete first chapter structure I described earlier. The Rathalos crossing into our world is not the resolution. It is the establishment of a stakes-level threat that a sequel would have to address. Something from the new world has entered our world. The connection between worlds, which was previously a one-way street, moving people from our world into the new world, has now been demonstrated as bidirectional, and the implications of that are vast. An apex creature from an ecosystem that dwarfs anything our world contains is now present in our ecosystem. The consequences of that are the story the film is setting up rather than the story it is telling. The sequence in our world, brief, partial, deliberately incomplete, is the film's most honest acknowledgement of what it is and isn't trying to do. It is not a complete story, it is a prologue. An extended, beautifully crafted, genuinely engaging prologue to a larger story that, as of this recording, has not been told. The sequel to Monster Hunter has been in development reportedly since the original film's release. Whether it is actually made remains to be seen, but the directional intention of the film's ending is unmistakable. This is a world that the filmmakers want to return to, and a story that they intended to continue. The final images of the film, before the credits, are constructed with a specific visual grammar that I want to walk you through carefully because there is more in them than a surface reading reveals. Artemis, having returned to our world and having dealt with the immediate Rathalos threat, stands at the boundary between the two worlds. She is no longer fully in our world in the way she was at the beginning of the film. She carries the new world with her, in her body, in her knowledge, in the quality of attention that she now brings to the world around her. The woman looking at the camera in the film's closing moments is not the woman we met at the beginning. She is not a soldier, she is a hunter, and the distinction is everything. The hunter, meanwhile, remains in the new world. Their separation, his in his world, her in hers, the portal between them a possibility rather than a certainty, is the film's final emotional note. Not a happy ending exactly, not a sad one either, something more complex and more honest. The acknowledgement that the relationships that change us most profoundly are sometimes the ones that exist across distances we cannot easily close. The hunter showed her how to survive an impossible world, and she showed him something too. What it looks like when someone from outside your world sees that world clearly, without the frameworks and assumptions that make natives blind to what they have. Their connection was real. Its continuation is unresolved, and that unresolved quality, rather than feeling like a narrative failure, feels to me like an honest acknowledgement of how transformative experiences actually work. The world changes. The relationship was real. What comes next is a question. There are hidden details and planted information throughout the film that I want to consolidate here because they deserve their own moment of attention. Watch the color of the sand in scenes immediately preceding a Diablo's emergence. It shifts from its standard orange tone to a slightly deeper, darker red in the immediate vicinity of where the creature will break through. This is a piece of practical environmental storytelling that is incredibly subtle on a first watch but becomes completely obvious on a second. The film is showing you the creature before it shows you the creature through the environmental signature of its movement. That is exceptional craft. Watch the hunter's eyes when he first sees Artemis's firearms. There is a very specific sequence of expressions, curiosity, evaluation, recalibration, that communicates his tactical intelligence without a single word. He is not impressed by the weapons because they are loud. He is evaluating whether they are useful in his world. And the conclusion he arrives at, that they have value but limited value in an ecosystem where the dominant organisms are too large and too armored for conventional ballistics to be decisive, is visible in his face. He gives her a specific look that the film frames carefully, and that look is him filing away information about what this stranger has and what it can and cannot do. Tonisha is doing something extraordinary in that 3-second moment, and it is something most people walk right past. The material of the weapons that the guild hunters carry, the composition of the blades, the structural design of the armor is all directly sourced from monster materials, and the film establishes this visually rather than through dialogue. If you look at the guild hunter's equipment and compare it to the visual texture of the creature designs, the connections are legible. The blade that the hunter uses against the Rathalos has an edge composition that matches the serrated plates of the Nursila's mandibles. The armor that Perman's admiral wears incorporates structural elements that correspond to the horn material of the Diablos. The world has its own material economy, and the visual design of the film encodes that economy in every piece of equipment. It rewards extremely close attention. There is a moment in the approach to the sky tower where the hunter pauses and performs a very specific gesture, a brief, almost private physical ritual that has no dialogue and no explanation. It is 12 frames of screen time at most, and it reads unmistakably as something devotional. Not prayer in any recognizable religious sense, something more fundamental, an acknowledgement of magnitude, a moment of gathering oneself in the face of something that deserves to be approached with full presence and respect. It is the hunter being fully himself in a moment that the film does not announce or underline, and it is, in my view, the most quietly beautiful thing in the film, because what it tells you about his relationship to this world and the creatures in it and the act of hunting itself, is more fully human than anything he could have said in any language. My personal reaction to the ending of this film, and I want to be honest about this because I think it is the thing that determines whether you rate this film a 7 or lower, is complicated. I found the incomplete resolution genuinely frustrating on a first watch. I wanted the story to close. I wanted the questions the film raised about the portal and the two worlds and the future of Artemis and the hunter to be answered at least partially in a way that gave the film a satisfying narrative shape. The sequel setup, which is where the film eventually lands, felt to me on first viewing like a creative shortcoming, a story that did not respect the audience enough to give them a complete experience. On second viewing, I felt differently. Not because my standard forward constitutes a complete narrative changed, but because I found more in the film's first and second acts than I had registered the first time. The survival sequences, the central relationship, the world building, there is genuine depth and craft in these elements that a single viewing in non optimal pandemic era conditions did not fully reveal. The film is better than its ending structure suggests, and the incomplete ending is a real problem, but it is a problem attached to a foundation that has more genuine quality than the critical reception acknowledged. That reevaluation is why the film sits at 7 for me rather than somewhere lower. The foundation is strong. The sequel dependency is a real limitation. Both things are true simultaneously. And speaking of that reevaluation, I want to stay in the spoiler territory for a little longer because there are layers of this film that I did not fully address in the walkthrough and that deserve their own careful examination. Because once you have seen everything the film does, once you know where it goes and how it gets there, certain earlier moments acquire a weight and a precision that you simply cannot appreciate on a blind first watch. And that second watch experience is, I think, one of the most genuine measures of a film's actual quality, not just whether it entertained you the first time, but whether it rewards the second time, whether knowing the destination changes how you feel about the journey. Let me start with something that I find genuinely fascinating about the film's opening 20 minutes when revisited with full knowledge of the story. The military operation that Artemis and her unit are conducting at the beginning, the search and rescue mission that brings them into the desert in the first place, is never completed, obviously. The portal crossing interrupts it entirely, and the film never returns to it. But here is what I want you to think about on a second watch. The mission itself, before the portal appears, is characterized by a specific quality of institutional certainty. Artemis and her unit are operating within a framework where everything is known, everything is categorized, everything has a protocol. They have maps, they have communication equipment, they have chain of command and radio contact and aerial surveillance. They have, in the fullest possible sense, the infrastructure of a civilization that has organized itself around the idea that the world is knowable and manageable. Every single element of that infrastructure is useless the moment they cross over. The maps are wrong because they are maps of a different world. The communications are dead because there is nothing to connect to. The chain of command is dissolved because the command structure only exists in relation to an institutional context that is now on the other side of a dimensional boundary. And what the film is doing in stripping all of this away so completely and so immediately is asking a question that it will spend its entire runtime answering. What is a human being when you take away every system they rely on to function? What is left when you remove the map and the radio and the mission briefing and the chain of command? The film's answer, lived out through Artemis across 90 minutes of screen time, is that what remains is either the willingness to keep going or the absence of it. And she keeps going, every single time, without exception, with a consistency that does not feel heroic in the conventional sense but feels deeply, recognizably human in a way that heroism often does not. Now I want to talk about something that almost nobody discusses when they discuss this film, which is the film's relationship to time. Monster Hunter has a very specific and unusual approach to its own timeline, and once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. The film does not give you precise temporal markers. You are never told how long Artemis has been in the New World. You are never told how many days have passed between the portal crossing and the arrival at the Guild Hunters settlement. The film operates in what I would describe as survival time, a quality of time that is not organized around clocks and calendars but around immediate need and immediate threat. You are hungry, so you find food. You are being hunted, so you find shelter. It is dark, so you stop moving and wait for light. The rhythm of survival replaces the rhythm of civilization, and the film's editing and pacing reflect that replacement rather than working against it. This is a more sophisticated temporal choice than it initially appears because it does something specific to your experience of the film's duration. The passages of time that feel longest are not the action sequences. They are the quiet moments between action sequences, the moments of rest and resource gathering and watchful waiting that constitute the majority of actual survival experience. The film gives these moments real screen time rather than compressing them into montage, and that decision creates a genuine immersive quality in the survival sequences. You feel the length of the days in the desert because the film does not skip past them. You feel the weight of accumulated exhaustion and resource scarcity because the film holds still long enough for you to register those things. And that patience, that willingness to let survival breathe at its own pace, is one of the things that makes the action sequences land with the impact they do. The contrast between the stillness and the violence is doing enormous emotional work. There is another detail in the film's construction that I want to bring your attention to, and it concerns the way the film uses parallel behavior between Artemis and the hunter to track the evolution of their relationship. In their first encounter, both of them approach each other using the same fundamental tactical logic. They assess the threat, they identify terrain advantages, they position themselves for maximum leverage. The methods are different because their words are different, but the underlying cognitive approach is identical. They are the same kind of person operating from the same kind of instinct in environments that have expressed those instincts through different specific skills. The film plants this observation visually. There is a specific shot held briefly where Artemis and the hunter are positioned at opposite ends of a confined space, and the framing places them in a visual symmetry that is unmistakably deliberate. Two figures, same posture, same quality of alert stillness, occupying opposite sides of the same frame. The film is telling you, through pure composition, that these two people are mirrors of each other, not identical, not interchangeable, but cut from the same fundamental human material. And once you see that visual parallel, you begin noticing it throughout the rest of the film. The moments where their behavior echoes each other, where one of them does something and the other does the same thing. Three scenes later, in a different context, where the film is continuously underlining the kinship between them through behavioral rhyme rather than dialogue. This technique, parallel action as characterization, is one of the oldest tools in visual storytelling, and it is not a tool that every director uses consciously or skillfully. The fact that it is deployed consistently and purposefully throughout Monster Hunter is, for me, one of the clearest indicators that the film is operating with more intention than its critical reception suggested. This is not a film that was thrown together. The visual intelligence is real, and it rewards close attention. I also want to talk about the film's use of scale as an emotional tool because it is something the film does with unusual consistency and sophistication. Scale in blockbuster cinema is usually deployed for shock. You reveal the size of something to make the audience gasp and then move on. Monster Hunter uses scale differently. It uses scale to establish and maintain a specific emotional state, the state of being genuinely fundamentally small in a world that is not organized around your comfort or your survival or your significance. The human figures in this film are almost never framed in a way that makes them appear dominant over their environment. The camera is almost always placed to make the environment larger than the humans inside it. The dunes are taller than they need to be. The sky is wider than it needs to be. The creatures are framed from angles that emphasize their size relative to the human body in ways that go beyond simple spectacle. And what this sustained visual approach creates, over 90 minutes of consistent application, is a cumulative feeling of genuine scale. Not a momentary gasp of a single impressive image, but the settled internalized understanding that you are in a world where human beings are not the measure of all things. That feeling, which is actually quite rare in blockbuster cinema, where the tendency is always to make the human protagonist feel large even against enormous adversaries, is the film's most consistent and most underappreciated achievement. It chips everything you feel about Artemis's survival, about the hunter's expertise, about what it actually costs these people to exist in this world. Because you believe at a physical and sensory level that the cost is real. There is a quiet recurring visual motif that the film uses throughout its runtime that I want to name specifically because I think it is doing thematic work that most viewers register subconsciously without identifying. It is the motif of the horizon. The film returns to horizon shots repeatedly, long held wide frames that show you the line between earth and sky in this world. And every time the film returns to this motif, the horizon is different. Sometimes it is close, constricted by rock formations and dunes. Sometimes it is impossibly distant, opening into a scale that feels almost planetary. But the horizon is always present, always framed deliberately, always the thing the camera finds when it wants to remind you of where you are and how large this world is. The horizon is, in the most fundamental visual terms, the line between the known and the unknown. What is on this side of it you can see, what is beyond it you cannot. And a film about a character who has been dropped into an unknown world and is constantly moving toward the next unknown, toward the next creature, the next challenge, the next piece of understanding about the world she now inhabits, uses the horizon as a continuous visual metaphor for that condition. Every time you see that wide shot with the horizon cutting the frame, the film is reminding you that Artemis is always moving towards something she cannot yet see, always operating at the edge of her knowledge, always with more world ahead of her than she has mapped behind her. That is a beautiful piece of sustained visual thinking, and it is there in almost every wide establishing shot in the film if you know to look for it. I want to spend a moment on the film's relationship to the specific gaming legacy it is drawing from, because this is a dimension of Monster Hunter that is genuinely interesting to think about and that gets lost in discussions that treat the film purely as cinema. The Monster Hunter video game franchise is built on a very specific experiential loop. You observe a creature, you learn its behavior and weaknesses, you prepare accordingly, you engage, you overcome, you use what you gain to prepare for the next challenge. It is a framework of iterative learning through direct engagement. It is, in its purest form, a loop about becoming capable through experience rather than through abstract knowledge. The film translates this loop into a narrative arc with real fidelity, and I do not think that fidelity is accidental. Artemis's progression through the film follows the game's experiential logic with remarkable precision. She observes the Diablos, learns what it can do, learns how it moves, learns what the terrain tells you about its proximity. She engages the Nursella, a different kind of challenge requiring a different kind of awareness, dark and fast and vertical where the Diablos was open and massive and subterranean. She learns from the hunter the specific knowledge she lacks, the material properties of this world's organisms, the tactical approaches that work in an ecosystem governed by apex creatures. And she carries all of that accumulated learning into the Rathalos engagement, where the combination of everything she has observed and learned and practiced is tested at the highest possible level. This is not a coincidence. This is the film honoring the specific experiential architecture of the property it is adapting. And for players of the games, that fidelity is deeply gratifying. Not because it reproduces the game's mechanics literally, but because it captures the game's emotional logic. The feeling of arriving at a challenge you could not have handled at the beginning of the game and realizing through the engagement that you have become exactly capable enough to meet it. That feeling is one of gaming's most distinctive pleasures, and Monster Hunter the film manages, against considerable odds, to translate it into cinematic terms. That translation is one of the film's most specific and most undervalued achievements. There is also something worth saying about the film's gender politics, which operate quietly but consistently throughout the runtime, and which deserve more attention than they typically receive in the conversation around this film. Artemis is a female military officer who is never, at any point in the film, defined by her gender. The film does not make her femininity a source of doubt or qualification or special comment. She is not the exceptional woman who has to prove herself in a male dominated space. She is simply the most capable person in the situation she finds herself in, and the film treats that capability as self evident and unremarkable. The hunter does not express surprise at her abilities. The guild hunters do not question her participation in the Rathalos engagement on the basis of gender. Her competence is the only relevant credential, and it is accepted as such. This sounds like a low bar, but in the landscape of action blockbusters, particularly those based on gaming IP, a space with a complicated history regarding the representation of female protagonists, the complete normalization of Artness's authority and capability is actually a meaningful creative choice. The film is not making a statement about gender, it is simply not making gender a statement at all. And in the specific context of a franchise adaptation that would easily have defaulted to less thoughtful choices, that restraint and that normalcy are worth acknowledging. One final observation before we move toward the verdict, and it is something that has stayed with me across multiple viewings of this film, in a way that I find difficult to fully articulate but genuinely important to try. Monster Hunter is a film about a person arriving somewhere completely foreign and finding to their surprise that the skills and qualities that made them who they are at home are actually more transferable than the home context suggested. The specific systems are different. The specific knowledge required is different. But the core of what Artemis is, her adaptability, her refusal to stop, her instinct for leading danger and responding to it intelligently, her capacity for trust, all of that travels. All of that works in the new world as well as it worked in the old one, and in some cases better, because the new world rewards those qualities more directly and more immediately than the institutional world she came from. There is something genuinely hopeful in that idea. The notion that what is most essentially you, the things underneath the roles and the titles and the systems, are the things most worth having and the things most likely to sustain you when everything else falls away. Monster Hunter does not present this as a comfortable or painless discovery. The cost of Artemis's transformation is everything she had before, the people she lost, the world she cannot return to, the life she built in a context that no longer exists for her in the same way. The film does not pretend that transformation is free, but it does insist, quietly and consistently, that what you become on the other side of real loss is real, and that the things you discover about yourself in the hardest circumstances are the truest things you will ever know about yourself. That is what this film is ultimately saying. Underneath the sand and the monsters and the dimensional portals and the creature design and the action choreography. That is the box inside the box. And I hope that now that we have opened it together, you feel about this film the way I feel about it. That it deserved more than it got, that it contains more than it shows on the surface, and that it is very much worth a second look with everything we have just unpacked sitting in your head. So, after everything we have opened up together, after the production story and the world building and the survival sequences and the central relationship and the thematic depths and the hidden details and the honest criticism and the full spoiler excavation, after all of that, where does Monster Hunter actually land? 7 out of 10. That is my rating, and I want to be precise about what that number means, because a 7 is not a consolation prize and it is not a shrug. A 7 from me means a film that does something genuinely well, something worth your time, something worth talking about, something that stays with you after the screen goes dark. A 7 also means a film that had the ingredients for something higher and made choices, or had choices made for it, that prevented it from reaching that ceiling. Monster Hunter is absolutely, specifically, honestly a 7, not a 6 trying to be generous, not an 8 being cautious. A 7 that was earned and a 7 that was limited in equal and clearly identifiable measure. What earned it is real. The survival sequences in the film's first half are among the most immersive and genuinely tense creature feature filmmaking in recent blockbuster history. The central relationship between Artemis and the hunter, built without shared language, communicated entirely through action and physical presence, and the careful choreography of mutual trust, is one of the most quietly effective partnerships in the genre. The visual world of the New World, built on one of Earth's oldest and most genuinely alien landscapes, has a scale and an authenticity that no fully digital environment could have replicated. The creature design, faithful to the games and realized with genuine craft, gives you organisms that feel biologically plausible and ecologically coherent rather than simply visually impressive. Mila Jovovich's performance in the solo survival sequences is better than the film received credit for. Tony Ya's physical presence gives the hunter a fully realized interiority that exists without a single line of exposition. The sound design is exceptional. The thematic architecture, the stripping of institutional identity to reveal essential self, the ecological philosophy embedded in the world building, the pre linguistic language of trust is more sophisticated than the film's surface suggests. These things are real, they earned the 7. What pulled it back is equally real. The incomplete narrative structure. The first chapter, Feeding, the sequel, Dependency, the questions raised and not answered, is a genuine limitation that affects the overall experience in ways that cannot be explained away by appreciation for the craft inside it. The supporting characters, particularly Artemis's unit and Ron Perlman's Admiral, are underdeveloped in ways that cost the film genuine emotional weight at key moments. The tonal shift in the third act creates a discontinuity that the film does not fully bridge. The pacing after the Rathalos engagement rushes through territory that deserved more time and more care. These things are also real. They pull back the 7. Exactly who should watch this film? If you love creature features, if the idea of genuinely well designed, biologically coherent apex organisms realized with craft and given real ecological weight is something that excites you, this film is absolutely for you. Watch it. If you are a fan of the Monster Hunter video games and you have been wondering whether the adaptation honors what makes that franchise special, the iterative learning loop, the creature design fidelity, the philosophy of engagement over domination, this film is better than you have been led to expect. Give it a chance. If you enjoy the Resident Evil film series and you have a relationship with the Anderson Jovovich creative partnership, you will find familiar pleasures here, executed with a visual ambition that represents genuine growth. If you are someone who appreciates survival cinema, films about what human beings are capable of when stripped of every support system, this film has a first half that belongs in a conversation with the best of that genre. If you are someone who needs a complete narrative arc to feel satisfied, if the sense of a story that ends at the midpoint of a larger story will frustrate you too much to appreciate what the film does well in its individual sequences, you should know that going in, it will not change over the course of the film. The incompleteness is structural and intentional. If you can make your peace with it, the film has significant rewards. If you cannot, those rewards will be overshadowed by the frustration. Know yourself before you press play. Watch it on the biggest screen you have access to, with the best sound system you can arrange. This is not a film for a phone screen or a laptop in a bright room. It is a film designed for scale and immersion, and the degree to which it works is directly proportional to the degree to which you can recreate the cinema experience at home. Dim the room, turn up the sound, give it the conditions it was designed for. On streaming, it is widely available and absolutely worth your time on those terms. If you are a genuine fan of the genre or the franchise, owning the physical media gives you the access to watch it multiple times with the kind of attention I have been advocating for throughout this breakdown, and it rewards that attention with things you will not find on a first casual viewing. Monster Hunter is a film that arrived in the worst possible circumstances, was judged against standards it was not trying to meet, found its real audience on the other side of the theatrical window, and has been quietly building a reputation that is significantly more generous and more accurate than the one it carried out of its opening weekend. It is a film built from genuine craft and genuine ambition, limited by structural choices and budget realities, elevated by two performances that do something rare and specific and real. It is a film that deserved more time and more trust from the industry that made it, and it is a film that, when you give it your full attention in the right conditions, gives you something back that is worth considerably more than the cost of that attention. Close the box on this one knowing that it is genuinely worth having opened it, and knowing that there is more inside it than the label suggested. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. And now that we have, I want to say thank you. Genuinely, properly. Thank you. If you made it this far through this breakdown, you are exactly who the film box is made for. You are the person who does not just watch films. You want to understand them. You want to know what is inside them. You want to feel what is underneath the surface and articulate what the film is actually doing beneath everything it appears to be doing. That is why this channel exists. And every time you watch a full breakdown like this one, you are part of the reason it keeps existing. So thank you. That is real. If this breakdown gave you something, if it changed how you see this film or made you want to revisit it with fresh eyes or simply kept you company for a while in the way that good film conversation does, please hit the like button. It is the simplest possible way to tell the channel that this kind of depth and this kind of commitment to genuinely opening films up is something you want more of. And subscribe if you have not already, because every breakdown on this channel is built on the same foundation as this one. Thorough, honest, genuinely curious, and always in service of the film and the people who love it. And I have a question for you in the comments, and I genuinely want to hear your answer on this one. Monster Hunter sets up a world and a central relationship and then ends before the story is complete. If this sequel were actually made, if Paul W.S., Anderson and Mila Jovovich and Tunisia returned to this world, what would you want that film to be? What questions does Monster Hunter leave you with that you most want answered? What would the continuation of Artemis's story look like if it were given everything this first film was denied? Leave that in the comments. I will be reading every response. Because that is a conversation I genuinely want to have with you. The next film we are opening on the film box is one that I have been sitting with for weeks, turning over in my hands, trying to figure out exactly how to do it justice. It is a film that looks like one thing and is completely another. A film that rewards patience and punishes distraction. A film that, once you understand what it is actually doing, becomes genuinely impossible to stop thinking about. I cannot wait to open it with you. Every film is a box, and we only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.